Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a city older than memory where the heat clings to your tunic and the river smells faintly of clay. You're in Babylon now, an empire of bricks, bronze, and blistering sunlight. You're barefoot on a narrow road of baked earth, and the shadow you cast is long and cool. You don't realize it yet, but this shadow is your calendar, your clock, and your only excuse for being late to anything important. There's no wristwatch here, no wall clock, no tiny glowing rectangle on your nightstand endlessly scrolling tick-tocks, just you, the sun, and a lot of very particular priests who will scowl if your shadow's pointing the wrong way when you arrive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly toward the city's center. Babylon isn't loud, but it hums with the rhythm of morning grain, being ground water jars clinking the grumble of camels that already regret being awake. The sun is climbing steadily, and the shadows are shrinking with it. At the Temple of Marduk, towering in the haze, priests glance at their own silhouettes, checking whether they're on schedule to light the incense. The temple complex isn't just a religious hub, it's also the ticking heart of Babylonian timekeeping. You pass by scribes with shaved heads and styluses hunched over clay tablets. Some are copying hymns, others sketching out what looks like geometry. Right angles, curved lines, and at the center of it all the humble ziggurat. These tiered temples aren't just pretty skyline features. They're multi-level platforms cast sharp-edged shadows that fall like sundial arms across the surrounding courtyards. Stand at the base long enough and you'll see the shadow creep forward, telling you when to pray, when to open the market stalls, when to stop making bricks and go home for lentil stew. The Babylonians didn't invent sundials, but they may have been the first to obsess over them. The ancient Egyptians had already begun using shadow clocks by this point, but the Babylonians added their own flair, dividing the day into measured segments, refining the art of the gnomon, a vertical rod whose shadow marked the time, and calculating the angles with the kind of nerdy fervor usually reserved for math teachers and dungeon masters. The smell of baked mud lingers as you pass workers repairing a collapsed wall. Even their schedule is dictated by shadow. They start as the sun rises and end when their hammers held upright no longer cast a long enough line to justify continuing. There's something oddly poetic about this sun-driven schedule. Time here isn't a number, it's a dance between light and stone. The priest doesn't say it's 9 a.m. He says, "The shadow touches the second pillar." He doesn't ask when the market opens. He watches the temple's eastern wall until the shade reaches the goat trough. Historians still argue whether Babylonian timekeeping was this standardized across the empire or whether each city-state winged it based on how many goats tripped over a shadow. What we do know is that temples were central physically and philosophically to the way time was interpreted. Time was sacred. It moved according to divine patterns, and your shadow was a kind of celestial thermometer. You follow a narrow path through the market, past stalls of dried fish, blue dyed wool, and clay amulets shaped like tiny lions. No bells or shouting merchants here, just soft bartering and sleepy yawns. The quiet might surprise you, but remember, it's still early. Most people are waiting for the right sliver of shade to signal that serious work can begin. Up ahead, an old woman sits on a low stool with a sun-bleached cloth over her head. She's selling small shadow sticks, miniature gnomons that parents buy for children so they can learn when not to whine for dinner. You smile. Babylonian parents clearly had the same struggles as modern ones. Some things never change. You turn a corner and walk alongside the Euphrates. The water glints gold under the sun, and you pass a young man squinting at the reflection of his own silhouette. He's aligning his position with a faint scratch in a riverbank wall. According to tradition, when his shadow meets that mark, it's time to offer a prayer to Nabu, god of wisdom and writing. He grumbles that he's off by half a foot and shuffles back into alignment. You can tell he does this every morning. All around, shadows stretch, pivot, and curl as the sun climbs. It's a slow-motion clock with no ticks, just the gentle progression of light across brick, water, and bone. One of the more fringe but delightful theories suggests that certain priests timed rituals not just by shadow length, but also by the color of the shade, bluer in early morning, redder near sunset. Most scholars dismiss it as wishful thinking, but part of you can't help imagining a robed priest squinting and muttering, "Nope, to lilac. Not time for goat sacrifice yet." As the morning presses on, you find yourself in the courtyard of a minor shrine. A priest is smoothing out a clay slab in the sun, waiting for it to harden just enough for writing. He glances at the small gnomon next to him and adjusts the angle slightly. A breeze tugs at your robe. The smell of bread wafts from a bakery nearby. You sit on a low step, watching your own shadow shrink toward your feet. It's not unpleasant. There's something comforting about knowing that in this place you don't need to do time. Time does you. It moves on its own, slow and sunlit. You just follow it like a long, cool ribbon laid out across the day. And somewhere in a quiet corner of a temple, a scribe etches a record of sunrise length and shadow fall into clay. Not because he's late for a meeting, but because he wants future scribes to know what time breakfast should start. Just imagine trying to explain Google Calendar to him. You're still seated on that sun-warmed step, blinking in the brightness when the air shifts again. The shadows have grown sharper, edging toward noon, and with them comes the faint creak of wooden shutters opening one by one. Shops, food stalls, even a barber's open-air bench slide into action, not at a set time, but at a shadow cue. Welcome to the Babylonian midday ritual, eating, praying, and maybe stealing a quick nap, all dictated by the movement of light. You follow the scent of something mildly burnt and vaguely oniony until you find a small vendor laying out bowls of lentil porridge and roasted dates. The old man manning the stall peers at a nearby temple's base, where the gnomon casts a thin, precise blade of shadow. Without looking at you, he says, "Not lunchtime yet." Then he ladles you a bowl anyway. Babylonian hospitality is apparently stronger than Babylonian punctuality. This world isn't obsessed with seconds or minutes, but it still knows routine. Shadows guide meals just as faithfully as your kitchen clock. Most people here eat in segments a morning snack, when your shadow's as long as you are a heartier midday meal when it's shorter, and maybe something light before the sun sinks and your silhouette stretches out again like it's trying to escape the heat. What's funny is that these time cues don't just organize the day, they also structure the city's flavor. Certain foods are only served during specific shadow lengths. Flatbread baked on the hot stones outside a home might be ready when the gnomon shadow just touches the outer edge of the cooking ring. If you're early, you get dough. Late, you get charcoal. The sun doesn't wait, and neither does the cook. One fringe theory, slightly spicy, possibly fictional, is that Babylonian cooks actually competed in shadow-timed bake-offs. The winner wasn't who baked the fastest, but who timed the rise perfectly with a known shadow mark. Sadly, no clay trophy evidence survives to confirm this. Historians still argue whether these competitions ever happened, or whether it's just something an imaginative scribe scribbled down to pad his temple logs. You walk through the market again, chewing your dates thoughtfully. The shade pools differently now. The tallest shadows have nearly disappeared, melting under the noontime sun, while smaller objects jugs baskets, small cats cast stubby little blobs that tremble with the heat. You pass a family gathered under a woven reed awning. The mother eyes the shadows along the ground and says something like, "Just 2 more finger widths till we rest." You glance down and try to measure. Hard to argue with shadow math. By now, your body is tuned to the pace. You aren't checking anything, there's nothing to check. Just light warmth and the subtle choreography of people syncing themselves to the Earth's rotation. No app required. There's a lull in the streets, and that's no accident. Many Babylonians, especially the older ones, take what we'd now call a siesta. When the sun is highest, work slows. You see someone curl up on a folded robe beneath a fig tree. Another person lays a clay tablet over his eyes, not for dramatic flair, just for shade. Even temple activity winds down. You wander into a side courtyard where a priest and his apprentice are carefully pouring water into a basin, watching the shadow of the rim creep inward. This isn't a sundial, it's a kind of timing bowl. As the shadow reaches a marked point on the basin's edge, the apprentice mutters something and jots on his wax tablet. They're testing water flow and solar position. You realize this is lunch break science. In a way, Babylonian life had fewer alarms, but more attention. You had to notice the world around you to know when it was time for anything. The way the light hit the ground, the coolness shifting on your skin, the way the shadow slid down the temple's edge like syrup. This form of timekeeping also made daily life deeply local. A shadow in one part of the city might fall just slightly differently in another. That's why temple courtyards broad open flat became the default clock plazas. You'd go there not just to worship, but to calibrate your day. Need to know if it's time to start baking barley cakes? Check the temple's third step. If your shadows kissing that stone get to kneading. Oddly, this meant the Babylonians had a shared rhythm without needing shared devices. You didn't need everyone to carry a sundial, you just needed them to look. And yes, occasionally argue about whether someone's shadow was truly long enough to end a shift. There's a reason ancient cuneiform includes passive-aggressive phrases like "he delayed unnecessarily." You wander back toward the city's edge, where farmers gather near the canal, their sandals caked in cracked white silt. They too look to the sun, but less for prayer, more for planting. Certain crops, they believe, do best when sown at specific shadow angles. One farmer shows you a stick with notch, marks his own homemade gnomon. His son holds it upright and compares its shadow to a pattern scratched in the mud. "Not yet," the boy says solemnly. His father nods. It's all strangely soothing. A world where productivity flows with the heat, where rest is a matter of watching the light, and where being on time mostly means agreeing on which stone step counts as the hour mark. By now, the sun has shifted just enough to cool the breeze. You watch as a group of children chase their own shadows in spirals, trying to stomp them out like little gods. One falls, laughs, then dramatically declares that his time is over. His friend corrects him, "No, it's your nap time." And really, what better way to mark the hours? You're further along the edge of Babylon now, where the scent of tamarisk trees mixes with the sharper notes of livestock and river mud. The city feels like it's exhaling its midday hush, lifting just a little. And as the shadows begin to lengthen again, something interesting starts to happen. People begin to look upward, not to check the time exactly, but to anticipate it. Because in Babylon afternoon, shadows weren't just practical, they were prophetic. You wander past a modest shrine devoted to Shamash, the sun god, whose very movement across the sky was considered divine law. Time didn't just exist, it radiated from him. The direction and length of your shadow wasn't just a schedule, it was an omen, a mood ring from the gods. This afternoon, for instance, your shadow is soft-edged and points directly at a faded fresco of a lion. Interpret that however you like. One priest you overhear mutters that a lengthening western shadow by the seventh tablet's edge means a good harvest. His assistant writes it down dutifully, though the boy clearly thinks this is complete nonsense. Historians still argue whether these kinds of readings were more ritual than science, but no doubt they shaped the daily mood. As the afternoon picks up, so does activity. Artisans return to work with their tools clinking like distant wind chimes. The potters especially depend on the sun's position for their firing schedules. Too early, and the pots crack from cold clay; too late, and they risk being undercooked. Their workshop walls have faintly marked shadow lines traced over generations with soot and red clay. You pause to watch a young apprentice lean his gnomon, a short bronze rod, at a fixed angle near the kiln's mouth. The shadow it casts lines up neatly with a symbol scratched in the wall, a small bird shape. That's the sign. He nods and begins arranging his clay pots, humming under his breath. No timers, just generations of light. One of the more peculiar things you pass is a street marker, half statue, half post, topped with what looks like a duck wearing a very serious expression. It's actually part of an old solar timing system. Certain streets were oriented so that when a shadow hit one of these duck posts, it meant a legal window had opened for contracts, for debts, for marriages. Duck shadow time to sign your life away. These systems weren't universally applied. Some parts of Babylon had more advanced shadow markers, while others probably just winged it. One dusty alley even has a wall carved with what appears to be a sundial, but the lines are badly off-center like a child did it after 3 cups of date wine. Even so, it works in its own quirky way. The people here know how to read their city like a giant solar manuscript. At a small public square, you spot a woman with a cloth bundle at her feet. She's waiting. She's set up her parcel so that when its shadow touches a nearby carved bull's hoof, she'll know it's time to meet someone. You can tell this isn't her first shadow rendezvous. She's fidgeting with a smooth stone that's been worn into a crescent from years of nervous thumb rubbing. You wonder what story lives inside that moment, what kind of promise or debt waits for a particular length of shadow. This brings us to another curious Babylonian habit: scheduling by shadow position and object. It's not just about where the sun is, but which item's shadow is being used. When the bakery pot's shadow crosses the fountain, for example, might be a more common time marker than the 3rd hour. It's deeply local. One historian even called it decentralized solar bureaucracy, which sounds more thrilling than it should. Some scholars suggest that shadow telling was part of early education. Children might have learned to tell time not with numbers, but with objects. The shadow reaches the goat pen snack. The column's edge hits the well lessons. And honestly, that makes more sense than trying to teach a 4-year-old what 3:45 means. A few dusty tablets even hint that some wealthy households employed personal sundials. Imagine that a customized stone slab in your courtyard, carefully aligned to your morning routines. Master Ardat prefers his figs when the shadow splits the cat statue's ears. Decadent, yes. Effective, also yes. You keep walking, and the sun has shifted noticeably now. You can feel the change more than see it. The air cools ever so slightly, and the sounds of the city begin to lift again. Children laughing, wheels squeaking, someone in the distance arguing about grain prices with what sounds like a very stubborn goat. In one courtyard, you catch sight of a strange ritual involving a tree. Yes, a sacred fig tree, its trunk circled by flat stones. A priestess is watching the shadow of a particular branch stretch across the ring. According to local belief, when the shadow reaches the outer stone, it's the right time to bless the harvest baskets. There's incense, there's chanting, there's also a chicken who appears extremely unimpressed by the entire affair. And so the afternoon unfurls, not in minutes or hours, but in a slow symphony of angles and glows. There's something mesmerizing about it. Time isn't a cage here, it's a current. You're not rushing to beat it. You're floating in it like a leaf on the Euphrates. One last quirky moment before the sun dips lower, a group of young scribes playing a game with their styluses. They each take turns setting a stick upright and guessing how long the shadow will be in 10 minutes. It's part math, part magic, part teenage boredom. The winner gets a honey cake. The loser has to copy inventory logs, motivation Babylonian style. As the late afternoon light deepens into amber and the wind picks up just enough to jostle a reed curtain or two, Babylon begins to sway into a slower, more golden rhythm. You're walking again, bare feet brushing warm stone, then cooler dust, trailing your own elongated shadow like a sleepy companion. It's almost the length of 2 ox carts now, which means it's time for something particular: evening rituals. Back near the ziggurat, you notice more people gathering than earlier. Not in haste, there's no rush here, but in quiet clusters like moths drifting toward a flame they trust. The shadows of the ziggurat's tiers stretch like staircase ghosts creeping eastward in jagged harmony. You remember that in this city, dusk doesn't arrive all at once, it leaks in one carved step at a time. Here, timing evening offerings is no small matter. The sun must kiss a specific part of the ziggurat's facade before the chant begins. There's even a carved lion mouth where the shadow must fall before they light the first incense. If the smoke rises before the lion is shaded, bad omen. Or more likely, a very awkward conversation with the temple supervisor. And here's a little-known tidbit. Temple architects didn't just design for grandeur. They calibrated shadow behavior. The angle of the courtyard, tiles, the slope of the staircases, even the height of ceremonial bowls, all positioned with the sun's daily arc in mind. Historians still argue whether they used proto-geometry or just thousands of years of trial and error. Either way, the result is the same, a building that tells time with elegance and zero gears. You pause at a small side shrine where an older woman carefully places oil into a stone lamp. She waits until the shadow of a specific column slides across the shrine's base. Only then does she strike the flint. To light it earlier would be impatient, possibly disrespectful. You're not sure whether it's ritual or superstition, but either way, the timing feels right. Somewhere a bronze bell rings a soft melodic tone that barely carries, and you realize it's not marking an hour. It's marking a moment. Probably someone's shadow crossing a threshold. Maybe someone has returned home. Or maybe it's just time to let the goats back into the yard. Wandering back into a residential quarter, you notice the architecture leans west, slightly skewed. The doorways are narrow but deep, creating long corridors of shade as the sun drops. This wasn't an accident. Babylonian homes were designed to harness evening shadows as natural cooling systems. You step into one and feel the temperature drop by what feels like 5 degrees. No air conditioning, just clever shadowcraft. A young boy is lying on a straw mat inside, watching the light creep along the wall like it's a movie. He's waiting for the shadow of the doorway to reach the far column. That's when he's allowed to eat the sweet. He's been holding some kind of sesame lump crumbling slightly in his palm. When it finally does, he devours it with the solemnity of a priest. Shadow snacking surprisingly sacred. Even among tradesmen, evening brought precision. You pass a brickmaker tapping the side of his last molded clay block, watching its shadow dissolve into the stone of the drying wall. Perfect time to stop, he mutters. Any later and it cracks funny. He offers you a lump of wet clay to try for yourself. Yours turns into something vaguely resembling a sad fish. He nods politely. You reach the banks of the Euphrates now, where the late light shimmers like hammered gold. Fishermen are hauling in nets, but not because of a schedule. They've been watching the river's surface for hours, waiting for the moment when their boat's shadow aligns with a certain reed cluster on the opposite bank. That's the fish crossing, according to them. Whether that's based in fact or just tradition passed down from someone's uncle is anyone's guess, but the baskets are full. Along the riverbank, a couple sits with their ankles dipped in the water, watching the reflections of their shadows ripple across the current. They don't speak. They don't need to. There's a rhythm to this hour. Conversations soften, movements slow. Even the city's dogs, so vocal earlier now, seem to pad more gently through the alleys. Another quirky Babylonian belief. Some thought shadows could store heat. There's even a theory that certain night amulets were charged by holding them in one's shadow during sunset. You try this yourself, holding a smooth pebble at arm's length, aligning your form just so. Does it work? Who knows? But for a moment it feels like you're participating in some very old, very quiet magic. You wander back into the inner city now, lit by small, flickering lamps and the orange-pink glaze of the dying sun. In one courtyard, a family eats dinner bread onions, something stewed and spiced. The matriarch glances up at the wall behind her where the family's ceremonial stick casts its last measurable shadow. She nods once. Time to bless the bread. If the earlier part of the day was about work and order, evening is where Babylon breathes into ritual. Shadow lengths guide not just meals, but stories, prayers, and tiny acts of timing passed from mother to daughter, scribe to student. This is not precision for the sake of control. It's timing for the sake of connection, to the earth, to the stars, to one another. You spot an astronomer climbing a ladder on a tower just before full dark. He carries a palm leaf scroll under one arm and a cup of something steaming. He's not just watching the stars, he's watching the last moments of the sun's departure. He records where the final shadow falls on a marked slab. According to some scholars, this was how lunar calendars were calibrated with a blend of solar geometry and good observational coffee. It's nearly night now. The city sounds different, quieter, but not silent. You hear distant laughter, someone plucking a string instrument, and the occasional creak of sandals over packed earth. One final shadow sweeps past your feet, thin and pointed like the tip of a reed pen. Then it disappears. Time here is not lost. It's absorbed. Into walls, into water, into memory. Night has nearly fallen over Babylon, and you can feel the shift in the air, not just in temperature, but in tone. The city doesn't fall silent, it simply changes rhythm. And interestingly enough, time doesn't stop just because the sun has. You'd think shadow-based timekeeping would bow out at this point, right? But no. Babylon finds a way. You're standing now in a garden courtyard dotted with oil lamps, their flames barely flickering in the breeze. A scribe sits nearby on a small cushion, squinting down at a wax tablet, notating something about last light and first cool breeze. Turns out, Babylonians also tracked shadow memory, meaning they recorded the timing and angles of shadows just before dusk, then used those observations to estimate the early hours of the night. Like a solar echo. Some scholars believe they even developed a sort of mnemonic system. A ritual performer might recite the positions of shadows as part of a chant, the temple lion swallowed by the west wall, the gatepole's tip kissing the cracked step. Poetic, absolutely. Accurate, debatable. But poetic wins when you're trying to remember something in the dark. You step quietly through a marketplace now shut for the evening. Its stalls are draped with woven cloths, and the smell of sun-warmed fruit still lingers in the air. The market's central post, carved with spiral notches, was once used to track afternoon shadow lengths. But even at night, people refer to it. "I'll meet you when the moon shadow hits the third notch," a woman whispers to her friend, slipping away like a ghost with a schedule. Historians still argue whether this practice was formal or just street slang for nightfall, but the concept of shadow slots persisted even after the sun vanished. You pause by a small statue of the goddess Ishtar, lit softly by a clay lantern. Behind her, a stone tablet leans against the wall. On it, etched lines, some short, some curved, mark the lengths of evening shadows during different lunar phases. This wasn't just superstition. These people documented darkness. They cataloged twilight. A priest nearby is aligning a rod in the sand, adjusting it by torchlight. He's not casting a shadow, he's anticipating one. By this time tomorrow, he murmurs, the sun will fall behind the western ziggurat 2 stones sooner. He's calculating the solar regression with nothing but a stick of memory and a remarkably good eye. Meanwhile, on a rooftop somewhere above, 2 teenagers are playing a betting game involving night shadows and torch angles. They hold up small sticks and guess how far the flickering light will stretch their silhouette onto the wall. Loser has to sing a lullaby to the house goats. The goats, from what you can tell, are indifferent either way. In wealthier homes, there's even evidence of shadow diaries, wax or clay tablets used to record personal routines alongside shadow observations. Things like, the shadow reached the upper basin, he returned home. Or, no shadow touched the threshold. Today he stayed away. These weren't just time logs. They were emotional weather reports. Back in the temple district, a night priest is adjusting a bronze disc embedded in the courtyard floor. When hit by moonlight at a certain angle, it aligns with a specific groove in the stone, an old lunar time signal. No one knows exactly how it worked. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just beautiful. What's truly fascinating and a little soothing if you're drifting off now is that Babylon didn't treat night as a blank. They layered their day with time's echoes. Evening shadows were remembered. Night movements were compared to previous dusk patterns. Even dreams were timed. Yes, dreams. Some tablets suggest that dreams occurring after the lion's shadow phase were considered messages from the dead, while those before were just brain static. Shadow-based dream logic. You can't make this stuff up unless, of course, you're dreaming it. You move now toward the city walls. The torches along the parapet throw long, moving shadows across the ground, more chaotic than the sun's measured lines, but still watched. Guards shift their posts, not by the hourglass, but by how the torchlight moves across their spears. When the shadow kisses the inner stone, wake the next man, one says. His comrade grunts in agreement, clearly mid-yawn. As you leave the inner walls, the sounds of the city soften into rustles and murmurs. A night breeze picks up carrying smells of earth dust and oil smoke. You spot a boy curled under a reed mat, a shadow puppet play still scratched into the sand beside him. Tiny figures, a priest, a lion, a sun disk. His story told in silhouettes. And here's one last curious practice before we drift further in some Babylonian households. It was common to extinguish lamps when shadows aligned in certain patterns. Not because of efficiency, but because of belief. When the lamp's glow splits the urn's neck, they'd say, "Sleep will be peaceful." A bedtime superstition. Sure, but when your whole life is measured in light and absence, even the tiniest shadow tells a story. You finally stop by the riverbank where reeds sway gently and the stars shimmer faintly overhead. The moon is climbing now, casting a softer silver light. You notice its glow catching the top of a carved obelisk, Babylon's last storyteller of the day. Its surface gleams for just a moment, then fades. And just like that, the shadows are gone, not ended, just waiting to return. By now, the city is a quilt of sleeping rooftops and hushed doorways, but your eyes remain open just a little longer, lulled by the rhythm of footsteps, soft echoes of sandals brushing stone, and the steady exhale of a civilization that never truly sleeps. Even in the dark, Babylon continues to keep time just differently. You make your way along the edge of a quiet temple courtyard where the lamps have mostly burned down to stubby flickers. Yet something odd catches your attention on the far side of the open plaza. Near a column, a small circle of white chalk marks the floor. Around it, stone pebbles placed at odd intervals. A group of children earlier in the evening had been playing Sun Chaser. The goal to guess where a shadow would fall tomorrow at midday. The winner gets a date stuffed with honey. It's a game, sure, but it's also how knowledge passes quietly between generations. No blackboards. Just sunstone and sleepy laughter. You step across the plaza slowly, your own shadow, now cast by the dim flicker of a torch left in a wall sconce. It wiggles along the wall like a lazy dancer, and you recall how even torch shadows were once studied. Some Babylonian night watch logs list the movement of flame shadows as time markers. Phrases like flame-crossed left shoulder of stone goat or flicker pointed west for 10 breaths. An ancient way of saying time is passing even when you're not looking. The city's scholarly scribes, of course, had their own late-night rituals. You spot one now sitting cross-legged behind a narrow window slit. By the glow of a single oil lamp, he reviews a small stack of clay tablets, each covered in careful cuneiform. He's not copying a myth or law, he's logging shadow changes from the equinox. Each entry begins the same way, when the sun returned from the south. Historians still argue whether these tablets were practical calendars, spiritual tools, or just an insomniac's obsession. Probably all three. But each one represents a different way Babylon tracked not just the present, but the cycle of presence. Time here was not only about now, but about how now connects to then and loops into soon. You make your way through a grove of date palms, their fronds rustling gently overhead. In the moonlight, the trunks seem etched with deep furrows, but these aren't natural. They were carved intentionally tallies, marking the year's longest shadows. One particularly aged palm has dozens of rings like a reverse sundial in vertical form, a kind of botanical ledger. And here's a particularly quirky tidbit: some believe Babylonian priests would train shadows. Yes, train them by manipulating surfaces and timing light sources to produce repeating patterns. The goal: teach students to anticipate the hour by instinct. Stand them in the same spot for weeks, observing how shadows shift across the same path. Eventually, they'd feel the time in their bones. A bit like internal sundial calibration, sleepy but effective. You emerge from the palms and find yourself near the back of a modest home. A woman sits just outside the doorway, weaving, not by sunlight, not even by lamp, but by the memory of the shadow she'd seen earlier. Her hands follow a pattern etched earlier into the sand, now gone, yet her fingers recall it. She hums softly, weaving rhythm in place of sight. Inside her home, a small water clock bubbles quietly. Yes, Babylon had those two rudimentary clepsydras, usually a bowl with a hole that emptied slowly into another. But rather than rely entirely on them, families used them alongside remembered shadows. Water for hours, shadows for moments. You picture an entire daybook made from both dripping clay and golden silhouettes. At the edge of the city, far from the ziggurats and formal courtyards, a shepherd rests under a stone awning with his flock. His staff stuck upright in the soil beside him won't cast a shadow until morning. But he's marked where it will fall. Just a line in the dirt. When it does, he'll know it's time to guide the goats back through the eastern gate. No rooster required, just light and patience. A meteor streaks across the sky so fast you almost doubt it happened. Somewhere nearby, a child gasps. Perhaps like many Babylonians, she believes it's a sign that time is hiccuping, pausing just long enough for the gods to notice her dream. It's comforting, really. Even the stars are bound to the schedule of the earth's spinning shadow. The Euphrates laps gently against its stone embankments. Reflections shimmer, broken by the occasional frog or drifting reed mat. Some say Babylonian boatmen judged time by moon reflection angles, using the shadow beneath their hull as a guide. If the moon touches the second plank, they'd say you're late for the west bank. There's something soothing about this blend of rough logic and delicate superstition. Babylon never demanded perfection from its timekeeping. It asked only for awareness, for observation. And maybe when the winds were calm and the sky was clear, for a little wonder. As you make your way back toward the ziggurat, now dark and monumental against the stars, you notice one final detail, a young apprentice lighting a torch along a carved groove on the plaza floor. Not just to see, but to recreate the length of a shadow from earlier that day. It's a rehearsal, a ritual. Maybe even an attempt to reset the day, if only symbolically. He steps back, squints, and nods satisfied. The light falls just where it should, and you watching realize something rather beautiful. In Babylon, the day never ends. It just folds gently into the next. The ziggurat looms above you now, Babylon's vast stairway to the heavens, still and silent under the moonlight. Its stepped layers rise like a shadow in reverse, a shape climbing into the sky rather than cast upon the earth. You ascend slowly, your feet brushing against smooth stone worn by centuries of footsteps, many of whom were also looking skyward in search of time. Near the summit, where the wind picks up ever so slightly, a priest kneels beside a curved bronze disc mounted into the floor. It's dark now, but in the right light, especially at dawn, it becomes something magical. An ancient time mirror. Earlier, this very disc caught the rising sun and funneled its light through a narrow slit in the wall, casting a thin shadow line that landed directly on the figure of a lion etched into the western parapet. They called it the roar of time. When that shadow roared, ceremonies began, and when it missed, they waited. Now, under stars and silence, the lion sleeps. You sit near the disc, cross-legged like the priest, and look around. The city stretches far into the darkness, its outlines softened by shadow, and the distant shimmer of oil lamps like constellations sprinkled across the earth instead of the sky. Here above it all, Babylon's timekeeping seems both brilliant and baffling. After all, this is a civilization that made entire calendars out of shade, that tracked planetary orbits with clay measured months by moon rises and guessed the hour from the shadow of a fig tree swaying in the breeze. Yet, for all its intelligence, there's something charmingly chaotic about it. Historians still debate whether Babylon's timekeeping was primarily scientific or spiritual. Some tablets suggest a structured hour system divided by both sun and moon, while others read more like poems than schedules. The truth: likely a mix of both. In Babylon, time wasn't so much counted as felt. You remember now the reed-carved time poles from earlier, their grooves cut not just to mark the day, but to listen to it. Babylonian culture didn't try to control time. It tried to harmonize with it. Even their sundials weren't perfectly round. Some were crescent-shaped, others triangular, adjusted for specific city quarters and their relation to the sun. What modern folks might call imprecise, they would call personal. You glance behind you at the priest who has begun to hum softly, perhaps marking the midpoint between moonrise and first glow. The ziggurat hums with him, not literally, of course, but rhythmically. You can almost hear the heartbeat of a city marking its minutes in shadows. Far below, near the city's eastern edge, someone lights the first pre-dawn torch. It's still night, but barely. The sky holds a whisper of silver. You remember what one scribe wrote, "When the stars blink fewer and the lion's ear turns pale, the day begins." That moment is now. A breeze shifts and you feel it on your skin, a cool touch almost like a nudge. It's time. As you begin your descent, a young boy passes you on his way up, likely a temple apprentice with dawn duties. He carries a narrow staff with feather markings etched along the side, a measuring stick, not for crops or buildings, but for light. He nods to you politely and keeps climbing, humming the same rhythm as the priest. A city with syncopated souls. Back on the street, the shadows begin their slow return. At first, they're gentle, thin, gray hints, stretching long and thin behind palm trees and roof edges. Then, with more certainty, they begin to take shape, brushing over the carved thresholds and the old gnomons planted in courtyards. You see someone step outside their home and glance instinctively at a wall where a morning shadow used to land. They nod and duck back inside. The time is remembered. Somewhere a potter begins to stir his kiln, checking not a clock, but the direction of sunlight on the floor tiles. A baker waits for the shadow to cross the oven mouth before kneading the dough. And in a small square near the river, a fisherman finishes tying his net, casting one final glance at a water clock dripping steadily into its basin. The sun's almost up. His boat will leave on time, not by seconds, but by shadows. You pause now for just a moment and take in the scene. A city greeting the sun not with alarms or bells, but with breath, with gesture, with the patient unfolding of shade and light. You realize this place, this moment, it doesn't demand attention. It invites it, softly, like a whisper. And maybe that's why Babylon feels so relaxing now. It doesn't race through the hours, it savors them. Each shadow is a conversation, a signal, a sigh. It's time not as a machine, but as a companion, one that walks beside you at the pace of the sun. And if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just lived an entire day in ancient Babylon, guided only by shadows. But if you're already drifting, then perfect. Let's wind down together now. The city lies quiet beneath the dawn. The air is still cool, and the sky, once a tapestry of stars, begins to glow with a gentle gold. There are no sharp sounds, no sudden movement, just the stretch of light across the rooftops like warm hands brushing across your skin. Somewhere, a goat bleats. A bird calls, once then falls silent. The priest at the ziggurat finishes his chant and steps back into the stone shadows of the temple. And slowly, softly, the sun begins its daily climb, casting fresh silhouettes across Babylon's walls. Take a deep breath now. Let the slow rhythm of this ancient city lull you. Every worn stone, every etched pole, every forgotten calendar detail, it all adds up to something peaceful, something grounding. A way of measuring time that doesn't hurry you along but sits beside you gently. Imagine the heat of the stones warming beneath your fingertips. The dry smell of clay mixed with fig leaves and cooling oil. The soft crunch of sand beneath sandals. The breeze that carries the scent of the river to your resting place. There's nothing left to do now. No sun to chase, no shadow to measure. Just this quiet moment drawn out like a long line of shade across a temple floor. And as the light rises, let yourself fall. Into sleep, into stillness, into the silence between sun and shadow.